The sneeze ended 6 months of diplomacy. Not the sneeze itself, technically. Yara Cowell would spend the next 2 hours arguing this distinction with Commander Hess, and she would lose, but the distinction was real and she was right to make it. The sneeze was involuntary. The part that ended 6 months of diplomacy was the sound the Vreth delegation made in response to the sneeze. A sound she could only describe as every single one of their respiratory membranes slamming shut at the same time, which she also could not have predicted, because nobody in Fleet Intel had mentioned that loud percussion sounds triggered a Vreth fight-or-flight response, so severe it caused involuntary evacuation of the sinus chamber. She hadn't even sneezed loudly. The conference room was still emptying when she grabbed her tablet. The Vreth moved fast when they moved, all 6 limbs fluid and silent except for the clacking of their forward manipulators against the floor, and they were through the pressure door and into the corridor before the sneeze had even finished echoing. Ambassador Fane, who had been mid-sentence about mineral rights on the disputed moons of Cathara 9, stood at the head of the table with his mouth still open. He closed it slowly. He looked at Cowell. "Allergies," she said. "I have allergies." "I know you have allergies," the ambassador said. "I approved your medical exemption for the anti-allergen suppression protocol." "Yes, sir." "Which requires the allergen suppressor to be active." A pause, in which Cowell communicated through posture alone that she had definitely had every intention of activating the suppressor, and this had simply not occurred. "Cowell." "Sir." "Did you turn on the suppressor?" "I turned on the environmental scrubbers." "Those are not the same thing." "They are both things that get turned on," she said, and then stopped talking because the ambassador's face had achieved a shade of red that she associated with outcomes unfavorable to her career. The Vreth were in the corridor. She could hear them, or rather, she could not hear them, which was the sound they made when they were very alarmed. The Vreth were a species that communicated partly through subharmonic resonance, and their resonance chambers went silent when they were in danger, and apparently they were in danger. She was also possibly in danger, different kind. The Vreth science observer, Queshta, had not followed the rest of the delegation. She noticed this because he was still in the room, standing at the far wall, which she supposed was technically the only safe direction, and looking at her with the kind of focused intensity that, on a human face, would have meant she had something in her teeth. He had 6 eyes arranged in a lateral ring around a skull the approximate shape of a river stone, and she couldn't have told you which 4 were looking at which part of the situation, but 2 of them were definitely fixed on her face. "I apologize for the disruption," she said, because she was professional and because she wasn't sure what else to do. "The delegation seems to have experienced some discomfort." Queshta said something in Vreth. His translator bead, embedded just below the outer ridge of his secondary jaw, had a half-second lag that gave the impression he was always being subtitled by someone thoughtful but slow. What, his translator rendered, was that? "A sneeze, it's involuntary. I am sorry for the—" "Not the noise," Queshta said, "the internal impact." She stopped. "When you made the noise," he said, "you displaced internal mass." She thought about it. "Yes, that happens when you sneeze. Diaphragm contracts air pressure." "Dense mass," Queshta said. He had taken 1 step toward her. "In your upper torso and facial regions. I observed a vibration pattern inconsistent with soft organic tissue." Another step. "Dense, rigid structural mass, vibrating." The ambassador, she realized, had left the room at some point. She couldn't blame him. He had larger problems. She had Queshta. "I can explain," she said. "You have bones," Queshta said. A pause. "Yes," she agreed, "I have bones." He was quiet for a moment that stretched. "Inside your body," he said. "That's generally where they go." Queshta's 2 front eyes shifted to a new position she hadn't seen before. She would later learn it was the expression that meant he was revising a foundational assumption in real time, which was, apparently uncomfortable for a Vreth scientist, like watching someone pull the Jenga block that the whole tower had been resting on. "Show me," he said. She had a choice. She could follow the ambassador, submit to the tribunal, begin what promised to be an extraordinarily unpleasant documentation process, and spend the next 6 months explaining to Fleet's Office of Diplomatic Incident Review exactly why she had thought environmental scrubbers and allergen suppressors were the same category of button. Or she could spend time with the one member of the Vreth delegation who hadn't run. "I'll need coffee," she said. Questa's translator rendered this as, "I will require a preparatory stimulant," which was accurate enough. The medical bay on platform Tharsis was designed to accommodate 4 species, which meant the scanning equipment was modular, and the lighting was a compromise that gave everyone a mild headache. Cowell sat on the exam table in her uniform shirt, which she'd only partially unlaced because the temperature in the bay was calibrated for beings who did not, technically, run warm. Questa stood on the far side of the scanning arch, which he had taken approximately 45 minutes to configure, and he had not spoken during any of those 45 minutes except to ask for the scan frequency range, twice. She drank her coffee. She had smuggled the thermos in under her arm. The scan began. It was painless, as promised, and it lasted long enough for her to finish the thermos and contemplate whether it would be professionally inappropriate to refill it. She decided it was not a professional situation that had norms applicable to this question, and she was saved from the decision when Questa made a sound. The sound was not from his translator. It was from him. It was the kind of sound that a person makes when they have been told a number they absolutely did not expect, and the number is much larger than anticipated. "Something wrong?" she asked. He said something. The translator lagged, processed. "This unit," his bead rendered carefully, "appears to have encountered an error. Your scanner, your femur." She looked down at her legs with the involuntary reflex of someone who has been told something is wrong with a part of them. Her legs appeared normal. "What about it?" "The density reading." He looked at the data, looked at her, looked at the data. "The density reading for the bone structure in your upper leg exceeds the structural tolerance rating for type 3 Vreth construction alloy." She thought about that. "Construction alloy," she repeated. "Used in load-bearing architecture," Questa said. "Bridges, pressurized hull sections." "Huh. You have bridge material inside your leg." "It's more that bridges have leg material in them," she said. "We got there first, evolutionarily speaking." Questa did not respond to this, because he had gone back to looking at the data, and the data appeared to be doing something he had not anticipated. She watched his lateral eye ring perform a slow rotation that she would come to recognize as the Vreth equivalent of blinking in disbelief. "This reading," he said slowly, "is for one bone. One femur, yeah. I've got around 206 of the things, depending on whether you count the sesamoids, which I never know if we're supposed to." The scan results had, according to the soft chime that sounded approximately 40 seconds later, crashed the portable database unit he'd brought in from the Vreth ship. She tried not to feel smug about this. She had mixed success. Questa stood very still. On a human, very still meant thinking. On a Vreth, she wasn't entirely sure, but she thought it was probably the same. "You are," he said carefully, "a biological organism." "Yes. Not constructed." "Not in the way you mean. I was grown, so to speak." "Grown," he repeated. The translator wrestled with the concept. "Produced by biological process, unguided." "Guided a bit by evolution, but yes." "And every human organism carries this internal skeleton. From around week 8 of fetal development, we start with cartilage. It ossifies, it turns into bone tissue. The density varies by location. Femur's one of the denser ones." She pulled up her knee, knocked on it with her knuckle. The sound was more solid than anyone expected the first time they heard it. Skull's not bad either. Questa looked at her knee. He looked at the crashed database. He looked back at her knee. You grow, he said, and his translator's pause was longer than usual, effortful, like it was trying to find a word for a thing that did not previously need a word. Internal architecture. We call it a skeleton, she said. It's pretty standard deathworld biology. When your planet is actively trying to kill you, it helps to have structural reinforcement. Your planet tried to kill you. Still does, Bit. She poured herself another coffee. Gravity's about a third again what you're used to. Predators on 6 out of 7 continents for most of our evolutionary history. Pathogens. Seasonal temperature variants that would qualify as a weapons test on most inhabited worlds. She sipped. We got structural. Questa was quiet for a long moment. The delegation, he said. Yes. When they fled the conference room. I noticed that, yes. They were, he paused, recalculated, afraid. She thought about Ambassador Fane's face, about the 6 months, about the tribunal waiting for her one deck up. So was I, she said honestly, but mine's got a skeleton to hold it together. Questa looked at the crashed database again, then back at her. The eye-ring did another slow rotation. I have more questions, he said. I have more coffee, she said. Ask away. The thing about being in deep diplomatic trouble, Yara Cowell had learned from watching other people be in it, is that it creates a specific kind of opportunity. Not a big opportunity. Not the kind you could take home and show your family. More like the kind you find at the back of a very dark drawer and it's a little bent, and you're not sure it fits anything, but you're also out of other options. She had approximately one of those. She left Questa in the medical bay at hour 3. He had requested access to the full skeletal diagram database, which medical had allowed because he was technically a credentialed observer. And technically, this was technically a medical exchange, technically. And she went to find Commander Hess. Hess was in her office, which was the small one next to the flag bridge, and she was doing the specific kind of sitting that indicated she had already made several decisions and was waiting for the person those decisions affected to arrive. Cowell sat down across from her without being invited. This was either confidence or the body language of someone who no longer had enough to lose to worry about the chair. Before you say anything, Cowell said. Tribunal, Hess said, pending. I know, before you formalize it. I am formalizing it. Questa didn't leave. A pause. Hess, to her credit, was the kind of officer who paused at new information rather than plowing through it. She had lasted 22 years in fleet diplomacy this way. I'm aware. He stayed because of the bones. Our bones. Human bones specifically. Cowell leaned forward. He ran a scan. He crashed his own equipment. Commander, the Vreth have never encountered deathworld megafauna. They don't have the biological framework for what we are. Questa spent 3 hours this afternoon operating under the working hypothesis that I might be a constructed entity with an organic surface layer. Hess looked at her. A robot, Cowell clarified. He thought I might be a robot that is also a person. He doesn't anymore. No, but the delegation doesn't know that. The delegation evacuated before the scan. She let that sit. The delegation left thinking a human made a loud noise and vibrated internally in a way that was not consistent with soft tissue. They think you're a robot. They think it's possible, which is different from knowing I'm not. She kept her voice level. Commander, we lost the ceasefire table over a sneeze. Cathara 9 is a 6-system conflict if those talks collapse. But right now Questa is in the medical bay asking questions that have never been asked before by a Vreth scientist, and I am the person with answers. Hess said nothing. Let me go back to the table, Cowell said. As whatever they think I am, let the ambiguity do some work. Give me a week. What you're describing, Hess said, is deception. What I'm describing, Cowell said, is not correcting a misunderstanding that we didn't cause immediately before it becomes useful. That is a very careful way to say deception. I'm in the comms division. We're all very careful. Hess looked at her for a long time, the kind of look that measured things Cowell didn't have instruments to read. No, Hess said. Cowell nodded, understood. She left. She walked down to the medical bay, where Questa was on question 47. She counted from his list about the tensile properties of human compact bone under torsional load. She sat down on the exam table. She answered question 47. She answered 48 and 49. And somewhere in the middle of 50, she decided she had already been in enough trouble today that the shape of the trouble probably didn't matter much. Questa, she said, do you think you could get the delegation back to the table? He looked at her with the careful irritation of a scientist who has been asked a question outside his brief. I am an observer, he said, not a negotiator. I know, but you've been observing me for 3 hours and you have more questions and the answers are at that table. She held his gaze 4 of his eyes approximately. Bring them back. Tell them you need a full assessment. Tell them breath science requires it. She paused. Tell them whatever you decide to tell them. His translator hummed. What would I be assessing? He asked. Whether we're what we appear to be, she said. I think that's a question worth answering. Questa was quiet for a moment. Outside, platform Tharsis continued its indifferent rotation, 6 light minutes from a sun that cared about none of this. Your skeleton, he said, the one you grew inside yourself. Yes. Does it break? She had been asked variations on this question all afternoon, always about stress tolerances and density ratings and load-bearing architecture. This one landed differently. This one sounded like he wasn't asking about bone. Everything breaks eventually, she said, but it takes a lot. Questa's eye-ring performed its slow rotation. Then he picked up his communicator.